You got your copy. You're muted, Natan. I can't hear you, Natan.
On Thursday morning arrived.
Ah.
I messaged for 12 hours.
All right, let me get my chat popped out. Minimize that. And let's share the screen with the Mishnah. Okay. And we're only at 7:01, so we'll give it an extra minute or so. And see if anyone else pops in. Good afternoon, Michelle.
Hey, good afternoon, Rabbi. Everyone.
My hands still smell like the hadass from the lulav. I was doing it with the kids for the afternoon school.
But did you do it in the sukkah or?
What's that?
No. Did you do it in the sukkah or?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic.
We only have 5 in person on Wednesday.
Well, that's better than no one. That's wonderful.
Well, we have 8 online, but I mean, it's very good. It means my hands smell like the myrtle again.
Yeah, I have to buy mine next year for sure, especially now that I'm doing the minyan in the morning and everybody's shaking the lulav except for me.
Feel a little left out?
Yeah.
All right, just another minute, I think. You're muted again, Natan.
Okay, now yes. If you don't have minyan, you say that Oshanot after the Hallel, correct?
You can do Hoshanot after Hallel or after Musaf. Either is fine.
So, so if I do Hallel, Oshanot, and Musaf, it's okay.
Correct. Well, I mean, you would technically go in
the middle. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, you technically go to Ashrei and Uvalat Zion, and then you'd go to Musaf.
To Musaf, okay. But I just wanted to be sure because I saw that in the Sidur that sometimes some communities they put Oshanot after Musaf and some after Hallel.
Correct.
Why? What's the difference?
The difference is a tradition of the community. So
what's the logic like behind each tradition?
So the logic for the Hallel is that Hoshanot are very much like Hallel, right? They you know the Hoshiana is very much like the same calling out that we do in Hallel. The logic behind doing it for Musaf is that Musaf is when you have the real flavor of the day come through most powerfully. Musaf is when the character of the day takes over. So doing Hoshanot and Musaf makes a lot of sense as well.
And Oshanot is without the etrog or with the etrog?
Without the trope?
The etrog.
No, it's with, well, I've always found most communities that I've had, they carry it with the etrog as well. It depends, you know, on how, it's not required in the same way as long as you have a proper lulav, but
yeah.
But most people will carry the etrog if they can. But some people, you know, get those giant etrogim, and that gets a little hard to be marching around with.
Yeah. Because the main for the Oshanot is the lulav, not the etrog.
Well, the main point is the actual Hoshiana. It's the crying out is the most important part.
Yeah, but at the end, Sheminit Atzeret is not. When is that Sheminit Atzeret? When we destroy the
Hoshana Rabbah.
Hoshana Rabbah.
Yes.
That is cool.
I mean,
you have a lot of stress. You have fury. Go and you relax at the end.
Hoshana Rabbah is such an interesting and undervalued holiday, because it doesn't have the full status of Hag. It often sort of gets ignored, but thematically, it's meant to be the final echo of Yom Kippur. That final, you let it go through Ne'ilah. Now this is really the last moment to do tshuva before the new year is fully begun.
I thought it's Sheminit Atzeret, the last opportunity that you have for tshuva.
Well, there's always a last opportunity after the last opportunity. But most people consider Hoshana Rabbah to be sort of the official last chance. Ne'ilah, technically Rosh Hashanah is your first last chance. And then the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days in between, is your next last chance. And then Yom Kippur is your last chance. And then Ne'ilah is your last chance. And then Hoshana Rabbah is your last chance. But really, Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, you are supposed to be done and good. You're not supposed to still be needing last chances.
So Hoshana Rabbah is the last chance because it's the last day of Sukkot.
Exactly. And Shmini Atzeret is when we begin the new blessing for Geshem. And Geshem is the ultimate symbol and metaphor.
Mincha, correct. In Mincha.
No, in Musaf.
And Musaf, yes, correct. Musaf.
In Israel, of course, Geshem is the ultimate symbol of what you need for prosperity for the new year, for having that blessing. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure you are good with God before that season begins. So that's why Hoshana Rabbah was sort of the last chance.
So when is the Hoshana Rabbah, Rabbi?
Friday.
Friday, okay.
It's always the last day of Sukkot.
But in the synagogue, we don't have anything.
We do not have when Hoshana Rabbah falls on a Sunday, we do it at the synagogue, but otherwise it's the community minyan.
Okay, so we're gonna do something there. Okay, I'll talk about the technical stuff when you want me to take out the sukkah and stuff later.
Well, the sukkah doesn't have to be taken down at a particular time, but we don't use the sukkot. We don't use a sukkah on Shmini Atzeret or Simchat Torah.
Okay.
And the community is still virtual, correct?
As far as I'm aware, yes. No one's told me otherwise.
Yeah, but it's not fun. You can't destroy the lulav in Hoshana Rabbah in your house.
Of course you can.
Really? I thought that you need to be around the bima and with the Torah.
That's where it's done because it's done as part of the Hoshanot.
Correct.
And we bring out the Torah at the bima on the Shulchan during the Hoshanot. Well, but if you can't, if you're all by yourself in the middle of nowhere or in the middle of our current situation, then of course you can do it wherever you are.
So Hoshanot you can do without the Torah, without the minyan.
Correct.
So when do you destroy the lulav in Hoshana Rabbah? At the end of the Hoshanot?
Yes, after you finish the last of the Hoshanot.
And you say something or?
Nope, there's no bracha, no special required liturgy.
So 7 times, correct? You need to kick.
That is a tradition. There again, it's not a halacha. It's minhagim of different communities. Some would hit it until the last leaf fell off. Some would do it for like just 7 and be done. But it's different minhagim of different communities, different customs.
What do you do with the lulav and the trog at the end? Because I heard that some custom is to preserve it until Pesach because it's kind of continue with the redemption and you don't want also to throw to the trash.
So a lot of people will keep the etrog. A lot of people will take the etrog and use it for making something, whether it be liquor or for baking. A lot of people will use the hadassim, the myrtle, for bisamim, for making a beautiful smell. And personally, I like to keep the lulav itself, and I use that to begin my biur chametz fire.
For what? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
The biur chametz, for burning of the chametz. Because by the time we reach Pesach, it is so dry that it catches fire like that.
True. So can you use the mirlo for Besagim for Abdallah?
Yes. All right. Well, that's our 10-minute Sukkah roundup. Let's go ahead and get to our Sotah.
The last question, if we are talking about that,
Yes.
can you use anything for Abdallah that have a smell?
No. So like you can't, use your perfume or something like that.
But natural?
Most natural things are considered okay. There are some, like that come from animals that are like, animal secretions, liquids out of animals that we don't use. But most plant-based things are okay. There's some argument, there's a bit of a machloket about different types of herbs in preparation, but that's beyond tonight. Okay. All right. So yeah, that's a lovely, sweet topic, the discussion of Sukkot and Besamim and the happy time of the year. But of course, Mishnah Sotah is not talking about happy times, right? Mishnah Sotah is talking about a very stressful time in a relationship. Quick, very, very small summary. I don't like to spend too much time recapping because you can always watch last week's YouTube video or read this on your own. But I just want to bring people up to speed of where we left off from last week. So last week, we saw that the section of chapter 5 that outline in the book of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar, that outlines this ceremony for finding reconciliation between a husband and wife who has been suspected of adultery, is very fenced in. It is very strongly guided by the teachings of the Hachamim, of the sages. And it is not just a whatever he feels like is fine. It is very limited in the scope. There needs to be a warning of her regarding a certain person. There needs to be witness of a seclusion, but no witnesses of actual sex in order to trigger all of the Sotah ritual, the drinking of the bitter waters. And even then, as we saw, there are many things that could prevent the going to Jerusalem. If she says, I don't want to drink it, then she is, off the hook. She doesn't get her ketubah, but she is does not have to go to Jerusalem. If he has sex with her, they do not go to Jerusalem at that point. The general feeling was among the sages, and I want to just give this a little bit from the Gemara. I try not to give too much from the Talmud, but was that the waters would only test the wife if the husband was also free from any transgression, meaning that the waters tested both of them. So if he was breaking halacha, then the waters would have no effect on her. It only worked if he was also beyond reproach, had not engaged in any of these immoral activities. So they really did consider this to be an egalitarian test. And if she was exonerated, that didn't mean necessarily she was exonerated. It could very well mean that he was actually guilty and so was she. Just a second, a little background noise on one of our other listeners. Okay, so with that in mind, we're now in Jerusalem and they have been trying to give her one last chance to not go through with the ceremony. Again, the rabbis did not want to do the ceremony if they could avoid it. Reason number one, they didn't want to do it was because doing the ceremony meant the erasing of God's name that had been written on the scroll, as we're going to talk about later in the Mishnah. Reason number two was because there were many different ways that the waters might fail to test her. And then if it was known that she really did do this, meaning she confessed after the fact, or someone else talked about it, or witnesses showed up later, then there might be people who began to doubt God and doubt Torah because it looked like the waters didn't work. But since there were so many other ways that she might not be affected, that was to be expected. that, the waters were not foolproof, because unfortunately people have found out ways to be fools in lots of different scenarios. Reason number 3 was, even if she was innocent, and even if the water proved that she was innocent, there would still be people who would say, she's probably not innocent. It's probably just not testing her because her husband is bad or because of some of the other reasons. So they felt that this ceremony really did not prove a lot. And therefore, they were very, very enthusiastic about trying to prevent it from taking place.
It's very interesting, Rabbi, because I always thought that they wanted to prevent because they want to avoid the humiliation to the woman. I thought that that was actually the reason why they try to avoid, in order to make shalom bayit between the society, the community, not make an extra humiliation and have problems with the family of the wife.
So yes, absolutely. They wanted shalom bayit. They wanted the husband and the wife to be reconciled to each other. They wanted the families to be fine. They didn't want the wife to be estranged from other members of the community. They didn't want the husband to be estranged from other members of the community or to create anger. So they absolutely wanted a better solution than all of this. However, they were of the opinion that the best solution was not to do it, rather than the best solution was to go through with it. If they needed to go through with it, of course, they would. But they would prefer, once all the things had taken place up to this point and they had reached Jerusalem, they would still rather not do any more if they could avoid it. And that brings us to chapter 1, Mishnah 5. If she said, I am defiled to you, which is basically a confession, right? But again, remember, a confession to adultery that wasn't, a confession to an adultery that wasn't witnessed and by people and that who did not warn her does not lead to a death sentence. Instead, it would just mean that she would be divorced. So what happens? She gives him a receipt for her ketubah and goes out, meaning with a get. She is divorced. Now, why does she have to give a receipt for the ketubah? Because otherwise, she could go later on to a court and claim that he never paid her. So she needs to get an official receipt to him so that everybody knows the ketubah has been dealt with. All right. But if she says, I am pure, right? This was the very end. She said it. Now we're on the track of doing the ceremony. They bring her up to the east gate, what was called Nicanor's gate. He was the one responsible for the construction of those gates, where they give women suspected of adultery the water to drink, purify women after childbirth, and purify lepers. So this particular gate, which was on the east side of the temple compound, was where these three categories of people would be present when their sacrifices were being offered. They couldn't go further into the temple grounds because of suspected impurity, but they could go up to this point. And what happens? A priest seizes her clothing, right? Grabs her tunic, her dress, and basically tears it open, right? So this is tearing the top of her clothes. And if they are torn, they're torn. And if they become unstitched, meaning if the seams come loose, they are unstitched until he uncovers her bosom. Now, the term is actually liba, her heart, but it basically means the top part of her chest, right? So we're not talking like stripped to the waist, but this is uncovering the top of her torso, her shoulders, and the top part of her chest. And he undoes her hair, right? So most women would wear their hair done in a braid, done somehow that was contained. That was considered modest. That was considered private. And he is undoing it, and it is now loose. This is meant to make her look disrespected, right? This is meant to humiliate her. This is meant to be embarrassing. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, says, if her bosom was beautiful, right, if her chest is pretty, he does not uncover it. And if her hair was beautiful, he does not undo it. Rabbi Yehuda is worried that far from being disgrace to her, if she's some supermodel, then you don't expose more of her because now you're making her this like sex object. And that's having the exact opposite effect. Rabbi Yehuda loses this argument, just for those of you who like to keep score. And instead, this is the procedure. This is meant to be embarrassing. It is meant to be degrading. Now, again, remember, this is not done just by the husband's whim. The husband had to warn her in front of witnesses. She had to be secluded with the person about which she was warned in front of witnesses. So there is definitely something that's been going on that is not ideal. And that means that at this point, some amount of degradation is considered all right. I know we would have different opinions of that in the modern world, but sometimes the threat of being embarrassed is worse than the threat of jail time or other types of penalties. I know many cities have experimented with publicly listing people who were arrested for drunk driving and things like that. And they usually will see that people are more likely to be careful if they know that their neighbors will find out than they are if they think that there's just a penalty like a criminal prosecution or a monetary fine. But that, whether or not some form of embarrassment is a useful judicial tool or not, is perhaps a broader conversation. All right, any questions on Mishnah 5? Okay. Mishnah 6. If she was clothed in white, he clothes her in black, meaning the Kohanim. If she wore gold jewelry or necklaces, earrings or finger rings, they remove them from her in order to make her repulsive. Again, they are trying to make it so that she is looking disheveled, looking unpleasant. They want to make people look at her and say, wow, what happened there? The whole idea is, based off what we know from the Torah, is that people should look and say, this is not a good situation.
It's very similar, the process that what you do with a slave that you capture in the war, after a war. If you want to catch, to keep her, that's all the stuff that you need to do in order to make her more ugly for the first 30 days. It's very similar.
Yes, although in fact, the treatment of the captive woman in wartime is less harsh than this, right? So yes, she is allowed to mourn and you have to leave her so that she will look unpleasant after the time she has spent mourning for her family. But you don't tear open her clothes, you don't put her on display. As we're going to see, you don't tie up her chest with this rope. So the captive is actually treated better than this person.
But you lose her hair also in both situations.
Yes, exactly.
And
although this
woman,
the Sotah's hair is not removed, it's not cut. It's just untied so that it's loose and looking, less attractive.
And both they need to wear a white tunic.
Right. Although here she's actually wearing black because the white is considered too good looking. And the Gemara goes on to say, if she looks good in black, we put her in something else that looks bad. That no matter what, we make her wear something that is unattractive. Whoever wishes, and after that, the priest takes a rope made of twigs. It's actually called an Egyptian rope. But this is understood by the Talmud to be made of either some very rough material or even palm leaves like you have on the wrapper for the lulav, and binds it over her chest, right? So this is basically keeping her clothes up so that she doesn't become naked in front of everybody. Whoever wishes to look upon her comes to look with the exception of her male and female slaves. since she has no shame in front of them, right? So basically, this is a public ceremony. This is not a private sacrifice. This is something that's going to happen publicly. And everybody can come except her slaves. Now, why not her slaves? Well, the Hebrew, I think, is actually quite helpful in this. The has no shame is useful, but it says, Shaliba gas bahem, right? That basically her heart, her emotions, her mood towards them, she is used to it, right? It is nothing to her. It is her heart is like proud in front of them, right? She can't be embarrassed in front of her slaves because they're her slaves. And they've probably seen her in various stages of undressed and getting ready in the morning and that kind of thing. So there is also the secondary issue that she might be more arrogant in front of them because she is their master. And therefore, if the slaves are there, she may refuse to confess even at this late moment out of being stubborn. So they are not brought in because it would only embolden her. And we don't want her emboldened. We want her to feel embarrassed so that she will confess whatever she has done. And all of the women are permitted to look upon her, as it is said that all women may be taught not to do after your lewdness, a quote taken from Ezekiel. Interestingly enough, in the context of Ezekiel, Yechezkel is not talking about routine adultery, meaning human to human sex. Yechezkel is talking about idolatry, that the nation of Israel, all of us in his day, had been running after our idols like a woman running after lovers rather than her husband. So this quote, while it is on the one hand saying that everyone will learn from her mistake, is also reminding us that the entire nation has made mistakes. It's not as though this woman is the only person who's ever made a mistake. All right, we good on Mishnah 6?
Yes.
Okay, Mishnah 7. All right, so now we are going to get into a concept that is going to open up a whole new realm of discussion. In the measure with which a person meets out to others, they meet out to him. This is what's known as sort of an aphorism or a proverb, right? Bamidah she'adam moded, bad modedin lo. Or as we say in the shorthand version in Hebrew, midah kineged midah. Right? This is the classic formulation that in English we might call it what goes around comes around, or as you reap, so you sow. Whatever you do comes back to you. In casual usage in modern English, someone might call it karma. It's not exactly what karma means, and karma is a different religious idea, but that's how it's used often in conversation. Another way to put this would be poetic justice. And we're going to see some examples in Mishnah 8 of poetic justice in other cases. But now we want to see exactly how this tit for tat works with the case of the Sotah. She adorned herself for sin, right? She got herself all pretty and dressed up to go out to meet her lover. So the omnipresent, Hamakom, God, makes her repulsive. She exposed herself for sin, right? She undressed in order to have intimacy with this other person that wasn't her husband. So the omnipresent exposes her, meaning he reveals her in front of everyone else. She began the transgression with the thigh and afterwards with the womb, or literally the stomach. And the phrase here is most likely a euphemism. The thigh is often used for not only the upper part of the leg, but what is found where the two upper parts of the legs meet, meaning to say genitalia. This is also considered to be part of the oath that Abraham has his servants swear when he puts the hand under the thigh. It's considered to be probably more than just the thigh, and more likely to be his actual manhood, if you will. Very symbolic in that case, and very symbolic here, because after all, it is the genitalia that are used for committing adultery. And the womb, the belly, is, of course, what receives the rest of that action, if you will. Therefore, she is punished first in the thigh and afterwards in the womb, nor does all the body escape. When you look through chapter 5 in Bamidbar in the book of Numbers, it talks about the thigh and the belly distending, of being affected. And this is simply making sure that we understand that the entire body is affected by the waters. The rabbis, of course, understanding that this would have a rather lethal effect on a woman who had committed adultery. All right, that was a lot to take in. Any questions? Wow, I must be getting too good at explaining things. All right, so let's move on to some examples of midah keneged midah from Jewish history. I'm going to have to scroll down to put the English on the page for everyone as I read. Samson went after his eyes. Therefore the Philistines put out his eyes. As it is said, and the Philistines laid hold of him and put out his eyes. So hopefully you know the story of Samson, one of the Shoftim, one of the judges in Israel during the period of the judges. Not exactly your role model kind of person. Not only was he pretty much only famous for being strong, but he was also famous for liking the ladies, which is what's being described here by going after his eyes. He would see a woman that he liked, and then he would begin a relationship. Let's be diplomatic. Unfortunately, the women that he liked tended not to be Jewish, and that tended to end up with trouble between him and the neighboring nation of Philistine. So it is not surprising then, says the Torah, or says rather the teaching of our sages, that because his eyes got him in trouble, his eyes were what were punished first by the Philistines. Everyone see how the logic works there? Okay. Absalom. Absalom was one of David's sons who led a rebellion against his father. Absalom was proud of his hair, therefore he was hanged by his hair. Very graphically at the end of his coup against his father, when he is fleeing, his horse goes underneath a tree and his hair becomes caught in the branches. And so he is literally left hanging from the tree when he is then killed by David's soldiers. And because he had had relations with 10 of his father's concubines, therefore they thrust 10 spears in him. As it is said, and 10 of Joab's young arm bearers closed in and struck him until he died. Basically, he committed the act of adultery against his father's wives 10 times, so he was penetrated. Again, this is graphic imagery here, 10 times by the spears of the soldiers. And because he stole 3 hearts, the heart of his father, the heart of the court, and the heart of Israel, meaning the nation, as it is said, so Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. Therefore, 3 darts were driven into him, as it is said, and he took 3 darts in his hands and drove them through the heart of Absalom. And that was when Joab killed Absalom at the end. Aaron, question.
Hey, Rabbi, I actually wondered about that. If a concubine sleeps with, concubines can commit adultery?
Oh, yes.
Because they're not married though, right?
They are not married in the sense of having gone through the formal marriage process, but when you are the concubine of the king, your infidelity is automatic if you sleep with someone other than the king. Any other questions or comments on this?
No, I didn't realize how terrible was his death. I had no idea how that came back so drastically on him. It was incredible.
Yeah, it came back to bite him quite literally. Absalom, the story of Absalom, and I definitely recommend that you look into the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel for this. Well, really, you should read the whole story of David and his life, is incredibly illustrative of the problems that these kingdoms were having with having the children, the sons, constantly vying for power and looking to take over before their father died. David, unfortunately, did not have a peaceful retirement. Throughout his life, he still struggled with his children. Yes, Aaron.
What does it mean by he stole the three hearts? The hearts of, I understand the heart of David, but the hearts of the court and the hearts of Israel.
So the heart of Israel means he got popular support. Absalom was a demagogue. He was a populist, if you will. He would go out and rouse the people up, saying that they were not getting a fair deal from his father. And specifically with the courts, he would wait outside the court, and he set himself up as an alternative for people going into to David for justice. And he offered to give justice rather than letting them go to his father. Go ahead.
I said, how can he be an alternative to the court? I thought the court had almost absolute authority between the court and David.
So, funny thing about both monarchies as well as courts, they're only as absolute as the people are willing to let them be. There is a social contract long before it was formally described as such by the Enlightenment philosophers, that basically if everybody chooses to ignore the king, and if everybody chooses to go to a different legal system, a different court or a different judge, the king has pretty much two options. He either just lives with it and basically is no longer really king, or he has to fight back and go to war to force people to accept his authority and his justice. And Absalom was basically counting on his father not having the stomach to fight him. And he was pretty much right. David did not put this down at the beginning, and that allowed Absalom to gain a great deal of power and indeed threatened David's life, and David had to flee the city. It was only when he was able to rally the troops with Joab and they were able to catch Absalom that they were able to crush this rebellion.
So they, when you talk about they were going to him instead of the court, it means both people had to go to him, right? Because if he just didn't want to fight Absalom, that's very well, but he could still go after the litigants.
Well, yes, but exactly how does a court compel people to come to it for its cases?
You detain them and put them in front of them?
Exactly.
That's how we do it.
If there is a mass movement of litigants who are going for civil issues, which is usually what these courts were about, do you really think the Davidic government had enough manpower and the willpower to show up at people's doors and say, stop going to my son, you must come here under penalty of death and present your case before the king?
But if they're civil, though, don't you just go forward without one of them if they voluntarily choose to be absent, and then you have the military enforce the order or judgment?
But if you have a demagogue that is spreading the rumor, spreading the lie that you can't get justice in David's court, come to my court instead, then you could willingly get both members to show up at your court.
Yeah.
Exactly. You're coming up against a coup. So that's a totally different situation.
Yeah, I figured if both wanted to go there, I figured there's nothing he could do about it. But if one objected,
well, but even if one objected, there is this populist movement that happened, where people would think they would be getting a better deal. And remember, the court deals that happened under the Davidic time period were not always winner takes all, like so many of our American court systems, right? Much of the times, if you were like two neighbors arguing over a piece of property, who owned which donkey, who owned which piece of land near a tree, the solution might be a compromise. And it's very easy to convince people that the compromise that you're going to give them is a better compromise than the compromise David might have given them. So it's important to remember that this is not the legal wrangling of the 21st century. This is much more of a communal discussion. And there would have been a lot of peer pressure to go where people thought the good court was. And this, same thing still happens. There's a one of my favorite quotes from Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who was one of my great teachers in rabbinic school. One of the great things he taught us very early on when we were talking about halakha and Jewish law in general and the philosophy of Judaism and being commanded was there is no amount of police you can have that can enforce a law that the people do not want to follow. Right? It is simply logistically impossible. He argued even if only 5% of the population were willing to break a law, it would be almost impossible for the police to force compliance with that law. There would simply be too many people breaking the law and too few police to watch it, and too few police to watch the police to make sure they were actually watching the law, because some of the police probably wouldn't have agreed with it as well. So once you get a shift in attitude and movement, once you get people drifting towards this alternative, it becomes a very sort of avalanche, snowball effect, where Absalom very quickly was able to seize the hearts and minds of the population. Demagoguery is a very old trick. It is not something that was invented in the 20th century.
Hey, Rabbi, were any of these people motivated to this uprising because they saw David do it with Saul? And obviously David didn't move to overthrow Saul, but they did see he was able to successfully.
The people were motivated because they thought they'd get a better deal. Right? I mean, the mob was willing to fall in line because the mob thought that Absalom was going to offer them something that David wasn't. You go to the mob and you say, hey, the current king is making you guys work, and he's making you pay taxes, and he's making you serve in his army. I'll give you a better deal. I'll cut your taxes. I won't, make your work as difficult. You won't have to serve in the army as long. Whatever you can promise. You know what? It's not hard to get people to think this new guy might be better than the old guy.
Yeah, but it's kind of hard to overthrow the government, though.
It's harder to overthrow the government now because there are many more, institutions that are in place to try and, first of all, make sure that more people have faith and confidence in the government, as well as the government will deliver on its promises of justice. But in the ancient world, overthrowing a government wasn't that hard. This is not the only overthrow attempt that David has to face. So it's not easy to establish a rule of law and the rule of a particular monarch during this time period. In the Northern Kingdom, the dynasties are overthrown with remarkable regularity. And we see that in other countries as well. This is not only a uniquely Israelite problem. Sometimes I think in America, we're a little bit naive to forget that we've had a few attempts to overthrow our government, both at the beginning in the Articles of Confederation period and the beginning of the Constitution. But most notably, that sort of war we had called the Civil War, when half the country decided that it was worth killing a few 100,000 people to try and get their right to own other human beings. So yeah, it's not actually that hard to whip people up into a mob to try and overthrow a government that you feel is not giving you what you want.
Yeah. The Civil War was actually a war of succession, not a war of overthrowing the government, right? Because they weren't trying to overthrow the government; they're trying to succeed.
Right. So that means that they are trying to overthrow the government control in half the nation.
Half.
So yes, they were not trying to conquer the rest of the nation, although they did invade. It is kind of important to remember that the army of Robert E. Lee did actually invade the northern territories. So it's not as though they were content to simply sit below the Mason-Dixon line. And a war of succession that involves, the confiscation of property and the assault on people in their territory, to me sounds a lot more than just, we want to be left alone. And plus, you can't just be left alone when what you're being left alone with is half the country. Countries that let that happen don't stay countries very long. Okay. Mishnah 9. Let's do another example from Jewish history. The same is true for good, right? So we've seen now the Sotah is a case of bad. If you do bad, bad stuff will happen to you in a way that is measured. We saw that with Samson. We saw that with Absalom. It's also true, however, that if you do good stuff will happen that is balanced for what you did. Miriam waited 1 hour for Moses, as it is said, and his sister stood afar off. They interpret that to mean an hour, mean waiting to see what would happen when his basket was placed in the reeds near Pharaoh's daughter's bath place. Therefore, Israel delayed for her 7 days in the wilderness, as it is said, and the people did not journey until Miriam was brought in again. This is after the incident where Miriam was speaking ill of Moses and was stricken with sara'at, the skin ailment, as a punishment. And the people wait until that's over, until that condition is done, until she comes in. And as you can see from the Torah, it says the people specifically waited. Now, you might argue that they waited because Moses waited, but this is trying to say that the nation waited for her because of the good she did. Does that mean they were doing it because they knew of the good she did, or that the events transpired this way as a natural consequence of the good she did? I would argue more the latter. Now, something you would also see here that is a little bit of a hint of the way the rabbis view this, that it says that she waited 1 hour for Moses, but how long did the people wait for her? 7 days, right? Midah keneged midah, when it goes for the good, is usually you get paid back with interest. You get paid back bonus for the good you do. We see this as well during the discussion of God with Moses, that when someone does something wrong, it will be, the effects will echo into the next few generations. But when someone does good, the effect will echo into 1,000 generations. So the reward for good is always much greater than the punishment for bad. Natan.
Yes. What? Can you hear me? Yes.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Why instead of 7 days? Why not a week? So in this case, it's the same value: 1 hour, one week, instead of 7 days.
Well, that's an interesting question. I would suggest you take it up with the author. Sorry. I haven't heard a particular explanation of why it would be broken into 7. Personally, I would argue, again, this is just off the top of my head, not something that I've read from any other commentary, that this is highlighting that it's not 1 for 1, but it's highlighting that it is 1 for 7. So that we get that implication that the payback for good is always going to be multifold compared to the good that was initially done, and very different than the more direct pay 1 for 1 for a bad deed.
Okay.
But that would just be my interpretation. Joseph had the merit of burying his father, and there was none among his brothers greater than he, as it said, and Joseph went up to bury his father, and there both chariots and horsemen went up with him. Right? So Joseph was a pretty amazing guy. Both, yes, we know about his job, but we also consider Joseph to have been the most exemplary of the brothers. He was the one who had the longest story arc, who had made the most transition, and the person who was most forgiving when his brothers were fearful. He was a great person. Whom do we have who is greater than Joseph, right? Who's going to bury Joseph? Well, it can't be his brothers, because he buried his father, showing great respect to his father, but no one greater than him, no one lesser than him would have the right merit to be able to bury him. However, none other than Moses occupied himself with the burial, right? Moses had the merit to bury the bones of Joseph, and there was none in Israel greater than he. As it said, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, right? So Joseph had the merit to bury his father, but no one in Joseph's time period had the merit to bury him, meaning in Israel. Moses comes along and he has the merit to be able to bury Joseph. So now what's the next question? Who's going to bury Moses? Whom do we have greater than Moses, since none other than the omnipresent God was occupied with his burial? As
The
it
answer
said,
is on Sunday, by the way.
what's that?
The answer is on Sunday.
Yes, exactly. When we have the reading from the end of the Torah.
Yes.
Right? Not only concerning Moses did they say this, but concerning all the righteous. As it is said, and your righteousness shall go before you, the presence of God shall gather you, meaning in death. So from Isaiah, the rabbis say, well, not only is Moses buried literally by God, but truly all the righteous are buried, are gathered by God. So it is trying to do this very interesting midrashic flip of going Jacob to Joseph, Joseph to Moses, Moses to God, and then God to all the righteous, so that all the righteous are now being put on a level that is equal to Moses. So this is, go ahead.
No, sorry, I thought that you finished. You finished?
I'm good for now, yes.
So that's good explanation if you want to compare why, for example, Eliyahu was God took him because a rightful like Moses. Okay, got it. But what happened with the other prophets? Many of the other prophets were as good as Eliyahu, and they were born when they were, I don't know.
They were not carried to heaven in a chariot.
Exactly, regular people put them in the earth.
But that's exactly the point. Is regular righteous people are not being buried literally by God. We don't just have a righteous person go out on the mountain and die and expect God to bury them. But regular righteous people are still taken care of by God, meaning that they are gathered to God directly. So this is a metaphor for the experience of the soul, not the body, when the body passes. So yes, the body is still dealt with like a regular person, but the process of the body, of the soul leaving the body, is more special in the case of the righteous than it is in the case of the mundane. Aaron, you have your hand up?
Yes. When we have this ascending order of, I'll use the word righteousness, how come they put Joseph above Jacob?
Well, because it fits the pattern, right? Somebody deserves to be buried by a person who is at least as meritorious than someone else. Now, what they really were saying is not necessarily that he was more righteous than his father, but they are saying that Joseph was the most righteous person around, right? Therefore, he is the one given the credit for doing the burial. Of course, we would expect his brothers went with them. It's not like Joseph buried his father and everyone else stayed in Egypt. But he is given the credit because he is the one who was the most meritorious of the brothers. However, his merit was so great that no one else was quite able to be worthy of burying him in Israel after his passing, and thus Moses comes along. Question, comment? All right. Sure. Just trying to remind myself. All right. Yeah, I think we can go ahead. We'll do just the first Mishnah from chapter 2 because I don't want to lose our momentum. And we'll probably finish there for tonight. All right. So chapter 2, Mishnah 1. The husband, I know that it's in brackets, but in Hebrew you can see very clearly that it is the masculine singular. And it's the husband's responsibility to bring the sacrifice that goes along with the Sotah ritual. The husband brings her meal offering in a basket of palm twigs and places it upon her hands in order to weary her. Now, again, this weariness is attempted to wear her down again so that she will confess if she has anything to confess to. With all other meal offerings, their beginnings and their end are in ministering vessels, right? These clay sharet, these special containers that were used for the pieces that would be offered as sacrifices. But with this, its beginning is in the basket of palm twigs, meaning this, again, this mitzrit, this Egyptian style, rough and not very ornate or suitable container. And its end is in the ministering vessel, is in the more normal item that would be used for the sacrifices. All other meal offerings require oil and frankincense. That was part of what went along with every other sacrifice. But this requires neither oil nor frankincense. You didn't use either of them for the offering of this particular grain offering. All other meal offerings come with wheat, come from wheat, but this comes from barley, right? And I don't know if we've talked about, well, we talked before when we studied Pesach, right? Barley is considered the lesser of the two grains, right? You can live on barley, but you'll enjoy wheat. There's a reason why if you go into your average supermarket today, you will find 100 different loaves of wheat, and you'll find maybe one or two that are made from barley. Nothing against barley, but wheat tastes better. It's also more calorically intensive, which if you are an ancient farmer rather than an overweight modern person, having more calories per kernel made a big difference for survival. So most things were brought with wheat because it was the better, more honored grain. This is being done with barley. The meal offering of the Omer, although it comes from barley, right? When we count the Omer, that also comes with barley because it's at the beginning of the barley season, but that was in the form of sifted flour, right? So it would be fine, good, pure barley. This, on the other hand, is from unsifted barley, right? It's just been the barley that was ground up, and it still has little bits of the kernel and bits of the husk and all of that. It's not good, right? This is blech. Rabban Gamliel says, he gives an interpretation of this, just as her actions were the actions of an animal, so her offering is considered like the food of animal, right? Animal's fodder, right? Because you would use leftover barley to feed your animals. You wouldn't feed your animals wheat. That was too precious. It was only for humans. But if you had extra barley, yeah, that you could throw to the animals. And therefore, this is being done in a particular way so that her offering does not come from the highest level of food. It is at the very, very bottom rung because her behavior exemplifies the bottom rung. Questions or comments on Mishnah 1 from chapter 2?
Yes, Rabbi.
Yes.
We skipped the last part when it talks about the animal, right? Or
No,
not?
I just said that.
No, that's right. All right.
Right, that Rabban Gamliel says that her offering is like animal food because her behavior was like animal behavior.
Oh, all right.
Any other questions or comments? All right, then we will leave it there and pick up with Mishnah 2 from chapter 2 when we start up again next Wednesday. Have a great evening, everyone.
All right. Thanks,
Take care.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Yasher Koach, Rabbi. Thank you for sure.
Thank you very much. Baruch Tiyeh. See you on the holiday.